This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Can I just say there's a couple of paintings, I know I'm really milking it, aren't I? There's a couple of paintings here done by participants. That's not a painting, you'll be able to tell, and that's just their memory as well, portrayed in a different way. So I just thought I'd point it out because I won't have time during the talk. Okay, so how do individuals make sense of their traumatic experiences? You can start the time now. Natural disasters are often etched in memories as a moment forever bookmarked in the mind, with survivors reflecting on why it happened, as the human propensity to actually pursue meanings from their experiences. In Australia, stories of bushfire survival and tragedy are well known, with major bushfires resulting in loss of human life, property and livestock. This paper is just one in a series from my PhD on how individuals and communities make sense of a bushfire crisis. Now, the purpose of this particular paper is to investigate how memories from a major bushfire disaster contribute to meaning. And the research questions I'll be actually focusing on is what is the role of memory from a traumatic event, how are experiences from a traumatic event remembered, and how have shared stories shifted memory. Now, survivors have actually shared their memories from their experiences in these Canberra bushfires, and such stories are considered an informative method of studying the human drive for sense-making and can be a really rich source of information about personal meaning. Now, I'll just give you a little background. Canberra, 18th of January 2003, the ACT experienced an unprecedented bushfire disaster that firefighters had no way of controlling. Unlike Black Saturday, only 4 people died, but there were nearly 500 homes destroyed. And there was widespread destruction of infrastructure, and many animals were killed, and 70% of the ACT, which is circled, was destroyed. And the theoretical framework driving my study is sense-making, which will provide insights into how individuals give meaning to particular events. Now, sense-making can be viewed as an interpretive process where we judge experiences, impending actions and who we are. Humphreys and Brown believe that identity is a fundamental construct of sense-making, represented through stories that people create to make sense of their world by reading meaning into their experiences. A narrative analysis of these stories can be used to connect micro-events to broader discourses, to show how storytellers construct and give meaning to their past experiences, focusing on those particular elements that are most salient to them. So this research will examine the memories of the survivors from the Canberra bushfires and how these recollections contribute to the meaning they've created from the event. Now, I've conducted 18 whole histories with 20 participants from the fires. There's a real cross-section. Some lost their home, some saved their home, there were firefighters in there, and also one woman who received really serious injuries in the fire that are permanent. Now, oral histories were used as the preferred research method because they are first-hand accounts of a particular event, often recreated through narratives where individuals share memories that have the special significance. So through oral histories, individuals can initiate sense-making processes as they create plausible accounts of their experiences by revealing layers of their memory. Now, oral history participants used anecdotes, metaphorical expressions and their senses when reflecting on their memories from the bushfire emergency. Despite the Canberra bushfires striking over 10 years ago, participants still have vivid memories from the event. Stories allow people to share their memories so they make more sense to the storyteller. They interest the audience and can be remembered in far more detail than a rendition of facts. There were many stories from my interviews that reflected on the dangers faced by those who stayed and fought the fires or fled for their lives. One woman recalling the scene that was unfolding. There were plastic chairs flying through the air and melting as they went, and poor old kangaroos were running around. They were hopping on fire, and they were on fire, hopping around like balls of fire. It was just awful. Then there was all these embers on the road, and it was just like a Red Sea everywhere, and all the trees were on fire. Every participant shared stories that reflected the danger they were in. Others shared stories of neighbours falling off roofs, fire trucks catching fire, mayhem with horrendous traffic, and the death and injury sustained by wildlife. Memories that reflect when one's own life is in danger are not easily forgotten. It cannot be denied that personal testimony delivers an emotional force to a lived event, and one element of storytelling so evident in the interviews but often absent from standard historical text is emotion. What can one say when someone recalls their darkest hours as she signed the form to permit doctors to cut off her daughter's hands? There are many short anecdotes that evoked an emotional response, and I still get goosebumps. As a storyteller travelled back in time, the following anecdote shows the emotion that creates meaning behind an individual's memories. I remember the poor old magpies. We used to feed the maggies, and that was very sad. I remember them. One maggie was standing there and he was just no feathers, and he'd come to see me, and that brought a tear to my eyes. Some of them just dropped down dead. Memories such as this mirror an individual's meaning because people choose to share memories that provide insight into their own identity and values. This woman often referred back to wildlife and the tragedies bestowed on such innocent victims throughout her interview. Many participants used stories to demonstrate a particular point they wanted to make. Often the moral of the story was controversial, unusual, or represented a side in a conflict that some did not endorse. For example, one participant told a story to justify her action of breaking the law and her determination to keep with a pre-prepared bushfire plan. The elderly woman remarked how she drove through a police roadblock in order to meet her husband. This story was told in such a way to condone the woman's actions of disobeying police authorities during the actual emergency. Many stories were told to validate a position or demonstrate a particular point. One woman had a story on the devious and underhanded tradesmen that took advantage of opportunities. She says, some of the repairs were shonky. The bloke that came in to paint was a real sleaze bag. And while Ron was in another room, he said to me, "You'd be very nice to me, I'd do extra for you." I think Ron would have killed him. He then saw a photo of my daughter. "You introduced me to her?" I said, "No." He was old enough to have 15, 16-year-old daughters, a real sleaze. People relive their memories by using imagery, metaphorical expressions and elaborate descriptions. One woman explicitly recalls images that remain prominent to this day.
I remember quite clearly two things. Number one, my husband saying, "We're dead, we're all gone," when he faced that huge wall of fire coming towards him, which miraculously stopped and switched directions. And lying in bed at my daughter's place that night, I was visualising, so I must have got a snapshot. So subliminally, I absorbed this image, looking at the houses opposite, burning to nothing, and it was the surreal aspect of it, to think 1 minute they're there, the next minute everything's gone.
So the notion of subliminally absorbed, it suggests that such recollections are not necessarily part of the conscious mind and pervade one's innermost being. Now, participants provided vivid recollections that are permanently etched in their memories. Just a few are presented to demonstrate the imagery that was used by participants. So many commented on how dark it became as the firefront approached. It just came out of nowhere, and many described how it turned black, and I mean pitch black. And the house was in total darkness. It was like midnight. Vivid memories were often presented as a narrative. One man recalled, and I won't play it because you can't hear him properly, "Then my daughter came home. The police had stopped all of the roads, but she snuck through a back way and she arrived and started throwing water everywhere as well. The funny thing, and this is a typical mother-daughter, Janet, my wife, yells out, 'Wipe your feet.' Then he laughs uproariously. There's soot and dirt and water sloshing everywhere in the place. Wipe your feet, you know? It was eerie, it was surreal, it was like slow motion." Tales like this made it easy for the listener to be transported back to the day of the firestorm and witness events unfold. Now, many of the descriptions used to illustrate events deployed metaphors that contrasted this extraordinary event with either objects or situations that were more familiar. Many participants used a war zone to depict the devastation. Images like the power of 5 atomic bombs, a bloody bomb site in Vietnam, Armageddon and tracer fire were used to construct the destruction from the fire. Others compared the event to natural disasters, painting, such as a huge tidal wave tsunami coming and the perfect storm that had all the factors to be totally destructive. Even creatures were used to describe the scene unfolding.
The ground was absolutely alive.
Alive with cinders.
The cinders were moving like insects. It was like there was fireflies all over the grass.
Such metaphorical language conjures images for the storyteller that depicts meanings taken from their experience. Listeners are also more likely to relate to the meanings such as the heat, the danger and the extraordinary circumstances that unfurled on the day. Now, Cunliffe and Coupland explain how embodiment incorporates emotions, bodily sensations, felt experiences, sensory knowing and lived experiences. Interviews indicated that embodiment was central to each individual's way of creating sense. What is most noteworthy is how many memories were recalled through the senses, which suggests that the senses, such as you mentioned with the smell, were used when extracting and creating meaning from circumstances. Many participants used a combination, another painting, of sensory images to describe the scenes. The noise of the fire was etched in everyone's memory. Participants commented on how they could hear the fire coming, and many metaphors were used to reflect on how the extraordinary event could be contrasted with more ordinary situations. Some stated it sounded like an express train, while others explained the roar of the fire was like being next to a 747 taking off. Touch and temperature were also recalled. The woman and her daughter who were badly burnt recalled.
Oh, it was immensely hot, and it was the thermal temperatures that did all the damage. It wasn't flame, it was just the heat. I think Nick had on a top that actually disintegrated, and that happened very early on, and she got fairly massive burns to her torso.
Extremes in temperature made some participants actually reflect on their own mortality. Even a fireman explained, "It was like my face was against the radiator, the heat was so intense. I suppose I reflected on that moment more than any other, because I really thought we were going to die. I thought, I've never experienced anything like this. Flashes of my children going through my head." Many spoke about the searing heat. One participant escaped the fire by sitting in a car, and her description was one of amazement and good fortune at actually surviving the fire front, even though they actually lost their ears from the actual intense temperatures. We sat in that Hyundai cooking, really, until the worst of it was over. And when we got out, we discovered that everything had melted on the car. But thank God the car had stayed intact. I don't know how it did, but it stayed intact. Others referred to the dryness in the air. One man commented it was very hot, and my wife kept bringing me out a towel, and I'd wrap it around my head, and in 5 minutes it would be dry as a bone. These recollections not only paint a picture for the listener, but embrace the meanings that participants took from that extraordinary day. Cues extracted from the environment are derived from all our senses, and not just from cognitive processes. Sense-making contributes to the total experience as individuals react and act on the phenomena in their environment. Now, scholars claim that when sense-making is driven by a psychological orientation, it can provide therapeutic and psychological benefits as recipients disclose memory of their traumatic experiences and transform painful messages into valued lessons that can be used to help others. Sense-making research can assist survivors of traumatic events to some sort of closure and acceptance. A few participants commented on how good it was to actually have someone listen to them.
I think everybody is over it. And people who weren't affected by anything, the attitude kind of annoys me the most, because it's like, oh, for God's sake, it happened 10 years ago, get on with it. You can't put yourself in anyone else's position unless you've been in it yourself. But I just think that that's an incredible response. Just get over it. Well, you can't get over it. Your head tells you probably should be moving on. But the very fact of getting up and looking into the mirror every morning means that it's always with you.
It should be noted that this woman received serious burns to 30% of her body and face because of the fires, and so those physical scars when she looks in the mirror aren't just going to fade over time. Now, people develop a story of past events to help them create meaning, but sense-making is temporal in nature, so often people revise their stories over time as they reflect on their experiences. One participant in particular could see how his memory of the event improved in time as he reflects on the events of the day.
I remember there were huge chunks of the incident. I couldn't remember. Probably a couple of years went past, blanks would fill in, like total blocks of memory would return. I go, oh, that's right. I don't know if it was triggers. I think I relate it more to a very stressful situation. Your coping mechanism is that you just block stuff out. That your memory chooses not to log it or bring it to your full memory because you can't deal with it. You're overloaded. So you remember bits and pieces.
Okay, remember bits and pieces. That was the end of the soundbite. Sorry about that. Nice play. This explanation demonstrates why sense-making is ongoing. Triggers such as meeting certain people, coverage of another major bushfire event may incite memories previously forgotten. But stress may be the reason some memories are initially blocked out because individuals need to cope with the event and move forward in their recovery. One participant said he must have been in shock because he states, I don't remember a lot of stuff. I have a friend who said she rang me about 20 times and I don't remember talking to her. Social networks are shown in this example to help people create meaning as they fill in gaps. Now, the ongoing nature of sense-making and how our memory fills in with time was presented as an analogy.
If you imagine a movie reel, you might have chunks of the movie missing in the middle, and then a couple of years later someone will ask you about it. That block of the film goes in and the picture becomes more and more. But I'm sure your memory, your mind just says you've got 1 million gigabytes of information there. You can only cope with 500,000 at the moment, so we're just going to store that. And I've read accounts of people who've been in battle, in war and things like that, the same thing, and they can't remember things, and then years later it comes back to them. And I certainly experienced that. There was a big chunk missing, and then a couple of years, or 18 months, 12 months, 2 years later, it started to fill in.
So others' memories become individuals' own stories to fill in gaps. Subsequent to the fires, one man who lost his home but was not in Canberra when the fires hit admitted he wanted to hear about the ferocity of the fire event. He stated the adrenaline was still running in some cases and they were going through their individual stories. We had some friends who had some close encounters, really close calls, and some of them did some heroic things to save their families. I suppose I was just amazed about listening to all these stories from our friends. So social networks have an important function in the sense-making process, not only for filling in blanks, but also in shaping views and creating meaning. Now, no two individuals have the exact same memories. One couple who was interviewed together disputed each other's recollections. I thought they were going to get divorced when I left them, actually. While one stating, "This is the first time I'm hearing about this," both challenged their memories constantly and observations of the other. The woman was considered very sociable and loved counsellors and talked to many people who had subsequently shaped her views. The man just wanted to move forward and resume a routine for his family. Time and again they disagreed, with comments like, "No, you're making this up now." So such disagreements reiterate the need to perhaps conduct oral histories individually, so people are free to give their own views and not be influenced by others. Another couple built their narrative together. They didn't necessarily challenge each other's view because they both believed that the fire was just one in a series of tragedies to strike their family. However, when alluding to a particular memory, one did prevent the other from completing the story. Conducting the oral history separately may have changed this outcome, because it was quite evident they'd handled the circumstances differently around the fire. The man was hit harder than the woman. He wanted to share his story in full, but the woman was more reserved. Now, just in discussion, there are a number of findings from this research to consider how memories contribute to how individuals have created meaning from the event. And I'll just address them using those focus of those research questions. So first, what is the role from a traumatic event? As White proposes, people create meaning on an ongoing basis, and gaps can be filled in through triggers that stimulate a memory. But more often than not, some of these gaps are from coping mechanisms. Gaps in memory could be part of the recovery process and can only fill in as people accept their traumatic experiences. White explains that individuals reflect on their experiences over time because following on from an unexpected catastrophic event, people need to restore order in their lives first before they muse over their experiences. Covello, he claims that the ability to process information is severely impaired when under stress, and it's only through time that survivors can reflect on their experiences. Second question, how are experiences from a traumatic event remembered? Traumatic events are forever bookmarked, as I said earlier. So if an event happens 10 years ago, it's still there. Often people use imagery or metaphorical expressions to describe their recollections. And in reliving their experiences, senses like the sound, touch and smell were used to embody the entire sensation. Many participants frame key points as stories to provide evidence or demonstrate a point and emotionally connect the listener. Stories also allow listeners to put themselves at the scene as storytellers relive their experiences. People remember facts better through stories because they contain characters, plots, and other cues that are extracted to have the account make sense. Stories are also a reflection of a storyteller's identity because they choose the parts of the story that are told and omit the details they consider less relevant. The third question, how has shared stories shifted memory? Many created meaning from their social networks, but only if the sources were consistent with what they already believed. This implies that social networks not only share information, but persuade each other in their individual meanings. People used other stories to develop a picture of how events unfolded, fill gaps or justify their stance. At times, people found they had blocks of memory missing, and talking to others after the day helped to complete the picture in their mind. The stories shared with each other also affirm the importance of social networks and how people connect post-event. Another painting. The findings have contributed to sense-making frameworks in extraordinary situations. Firstly, memories that were recalled tended to be consistent with overall tone and theme of interviews. Those who were angry backed up their position with anecdotes to justify their stance, and there was a lot of those. Those who saw the fires as an act of God were more accepting of the devastation and immediately worked toward their recovery, and others. Memories from a traumatic event are reconstructed through the senses. Sense-making contributes to the total experience as individuals react and act on the phenomena in their environment. Thirdly, the descriptive images and contrast with metaphorical references enabled the researcher to get a sense of the embodied nature of the memories that were shared. Few scholars that research trauma and memory reflected on the imagery sustained in the individual's accounts of the particular experience. Fourth, individual memories were told in more elaborate detail than retelling someone else's memories. Other people's memories were often told as stories, which indicate how stories with plots and characters are easy to remember, although some relevant facts may be skewed or omitted each time the story is shared. And finally, oral histories are the most appropriate research method for collecting first-hand from traumatic events because they do capture the meanings that embody people's experiences. Memories so vivid that defy explanation grasp the salience of the moment and the impact such an event can have in defining someone's identity. That's it.
Great.
It is painting.
First question. Well, I'm first.
Okay.
One of the questions in the last session was, what's the role of time? Would it make much difference if you conducted the interviews immediately after the fire, 10 years later, 20 years later? And we've just had 3 speakers where each of you is...
different.
Yeah, different. And what's your view?
Well, sense-making is about one of the properties of sense reality. It does look at time. So people do change their positions over time. I'll tell you why I chose these fires. These fires were 10 years ago, and my house burnt down in a bushfire just before the Canberra ones. And so I knew where they were in their recovery. And going through ethics clearance and all those kind of things, I really had to try and minimise harm. And that actually was a little bit of a guiding factor because I didn't want to cause harm to anyone. And as it was, there were still a few that were I was still in tears anyway. I'd also had someone recommend not Victoria because a lot of people were researching Victoria fires and they were getting a little bit researched out. And when I looked at this, people said they're actually glad I came down now. They actually had closure. I've left a lot of stuff out, but people had closure talking about it now. One person said he was so angry for years and couldn't let it go, and his family were going to put him down. And then at the end, he rang me back and he said, "Thank you so much. I have now got closure and I can move forward. Here, come back to my house and take all my stuff." So the actual 10 years was it was like a memorial kind of one. But there's no doubt that meanings do change over time. There's no doubt about it at all. And because it's the community disaster and people talk in that period, that would also shift memories. So I think the notion of time has a huge impact on how people create meanings from the particular events.
I think the Wagga Wagga Floods project we did is quite experimental in a way. I'm still thinking about it and still open to revising things and maybe doing them differently next time. But I think the thing about the Wagga Wagga one was that it was, as Peg says, there's no right time and every situation is different. And I think it's really the standout thing with Wagga Wagga is that it's a place that always floods. It's had 70 floods since 1844 and it is part of Wagga Wagga's story. And it was not devastated by that flood. It was a very traumatic flood, but it wasn't, no one died for a start. I think that makes a big difference. And they knew it was coming. They'd had 2 weeks of rain. So there was a lot of people who had that local knowledge, who'd lived there years, they were expecting the flood. And they knew that all the signs were there for that flood. And again, I've compared it to Nyngan in our collection, the 1990 Nyngan flood, which that was a very traumatic flood because that was out of the blue. That was a 1 in 500 years or something. It inundated the whole town, and that really was a far more like a Cyclone Tracy kind of event. So there are these, there is a relativity here, definitely.
Sorry, if I could just jump, you've actually partly gone into what I had a question about, and particularly for those of you that have done the literature around disasters. I just wondered if there was a difference between a flood in a location where that was part of everyday experience in the sense that they repeat. Cyclones are sort of somewhat different. You live in a cyclone zone. Darwin suffered, 3 major cyclones, people say. You sort of expect them. There seems to be something in my mind, something very random about bushfires, even though I'm, originally from South Australia. I know you can live in a bushfire zone, but I just wonder if there's any work around whether there is a difference to how people respond in terms of the nature of the disaster.
I think a lot, like the bushfires in Canberra, they'd experienced several bushfires over many years, but they were mainly grass fires, like wildfires, not bushfires per se. And one of the men I interviewed was a very experienced fireman. He'd been a captain of a fire, his local fire brigade for 40 years. And he said one of the issues that struck Canberra, and it's even more prevalent now, like he's really worried when the next one hits, is that he's not getting, kids, he said it's good, but it's bad that kids aren't lighting fires now. They're playing on computers and stuff inside. And he said it's creating an issue because they're not getting, the importance of the issue driven home to people to actually do something about preparing, which is what's going to impact and make it more extraordinary than it should be. And secondly, he said firefighters aren't getting the experience of fighting the fires. So another fire of a lower scale will probably be just as extraordinary because people aren't prepared and don't know what to do. And I've got lots of stuff. I've actually done quite a bit of work on how people made sense during the emergency and heaps of stuff on after the emergency. And so I think the next bushfire in Canberra, as opposed to grass fire, will be not quite as extraordinary as this one maybe, but still going to be quite a major event because of people are not prepared and are not preparing as such. Some people might be, but the majority of people I spoke to basically said, no, it's not going to hit in our lifetime, etc., because they're thinking of that scale. The fact is people aren't preparing and people aren't even learning how to fight fires because there isn't any to learn from. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
That's a really interesting question. I actually found that there were 2 different approaches to that idea of bushfires being either random or part of a cycle. And some people said, this is the way our environment works. There will always be bushfires. Some will be bigger than others. There will have longer periods, stretches between bushfires and then shorter stretches. But it is part of the natural world and the bush will recover and life will go on. And then there were other people who regarded bushfires as being an act of God, to use Sue's expression, that were a complete disconnect from what they saw as being the rightful natural cycle. And some of that was kind of dependent on whether they had a long history in the bushfire zone or whether they had had personal experience of bushfire, but it wasn't necessarily dependent on that. So there was a link, but there were people who had moved out from the city who accepted that bushfires were simply part of the natural cycle and you had to learn to cope with them. And there were people whose family had been there for generations who could not accept bushfire as being part of the natural world.
In your little reference to the fact that your house burnt down, and I wondered how your personal experience influences your choice of a research area, and also how your personal experience sits with you when you are interviewing people who have lost their homes in this way.
Well, that's why I pursued oral histories over, say, in-depth interviewing, because oral histories allowed the narrator to take more control of the situation. I chose Canberra for a few reasons. One is I knew where they would be in their recovery, sort of. That was one part. I have to admit, location was a very helpful factor as well, because I don't live a long way from Canberra, so that in itself made it a very practical one. But I don't think... I got interviews because my house had burnt down. I have to admit, some people said, we wouldn't have talked to you if you had no idea what was happening. So a few did say that. But at the same time, there's very little reference to me by the participants, and I certainly don't talk about myself in the interview either, because I was very conscious of that. I did not want to skew it to be about my experiences. I wanted it to be about theirs. So now and then they might say, and you'd know this or you'd know that, but they're the kind of things that I didn't actually comment on. So I tried to make sure my experience didn't skew what they were talking about, because I did want to be about their experience. And their experience was different. There was lots of similarities, but theirs was far more extraordinary. Far more extraordinary. And I think that's what made it like it was a big one. It wasn't just a normal bushfire. And it's the same with the Black Saturday ones. That was extraordinary, even though they normally would, and they'd all probably still struggle to cope with that. But in normal bushfires, people would probably have a better idea and be more accepting of it.
It's kind of a follow-on to what this lady in front of me said. It was because of that comment you made about having been through fire yourself, and the powerful story Peg talked about, the relationship with Zelma changing her way of thinking about oral history and about the interview. I just wondered whether listening to people telling their stories, what impact or change or anything it had on you having been through something similar.
It's funny, most participants, I could relate to little bits and pieces of their experience. I never said it, I may have said it later, or I probably didn't say it at all, but every single one of them had snippets where I could relate to it. Like, for example, one person was talking about how their neighbours wished their house had burnt down. And I could relate to that because we have people like that live around us, because we've, of course, got a new home. So that's the notion of who's a victim now. And then there was people who said it was incredibly inconvenient, and I have to admit that's how I saw it, because I'd actually had much more major tragedy happen to me. So I didn't see it as a devastation, I saw it as an inconvenience and was going to stop some of our plans temporarily. So there was lots of things that came out, but I never wanted to dominate the interview. I really needed to be about them, but I had to have something that was going to drive me and shape me, and so I don't think it's changed my perspective. It's driven things home, but I had to have something that was going to make me interested for 4 years, because it was my PhD, so I had to have a topic that was interesting that I could also cope with. That was another reason for bushfire. There is a lady at the back as well.
Oh, is there? Okay, final two questions. The lady at the back, I believe, was first, and then the gentleman.
Thanks everybody, fantastic papers. And just quickly, Susan, I think my dad was one of the people you spoke to, and those are his paintings. So I just wanted to say...
What's his surname?
Boyle.
That's him.
So he'll be really stoked that you used his pictures. Thanks for that. And I tried to talk to my parents about it too. Like, everybody wrote down their account of the day. I was in Canberra, we're all in Canberra. And as you probably have realised, my dad is full of talk. Lots of talk, and talking is how he recovered. But my mother doesn't want to talk at all. You know, she's happy to write it down maybe, but she doesn't really want to go over and over it. So again, I guess it just got my own personal insight at that time into how different people process their memories. And yeah, it was like that through the whole family. And yeah, anyway, so thanks.
By the way, your dad was one of the people that said he wouldn't have talked to me if I hadn't had it happen to me, because he wanted to know...
That's true. I think you'd have talked.
He was great.